Hi, and we're in our ninth book of the Bible. Can you believe it? We're already in the book of Ruth, which we will be finishing today because it's just 4 chapters. So, how proud are you of yourself? I know I'm so proud of myself. Let's jump right into the book of Ruth. So, the book of Ruth was set in the days of the judges, when there was a famine, and I think that was probably due to that cycle of apostasy and repentance that the Israelites were doing, and it was probably due to all their lawlessness and their wickedness. And we obviously get to meet Naomi and her family, and after the death of her husband and her sons, she leaves she's left in a precarious way as a widow. If you remember, when God was giving the laws, he always used to single out the widows and the orphans because the laws ordinarily didn't give much concession to them. So I guess it didn't make sense to her to continue to live in Moab, a place where obviously they didn't have any laws to protect widows, and she decided to go back. And as she prepared to return to her land after hearing that God had blessed them and, with bread, meaning that the famine was over on that side, Ruth displayed loyalty to Naomi by not accepting to leave her, but to follow her customs and to cling to her. Even though as a young widow, she still had a place at her home. Back then, young widows could go back and still, be provided for by their families, but she chose to return to Israel. I think it was a very bold move because she knew she wasn't an Israelite, and obviously there would be, even though they had started to intermarry, she would always just be a foreigner, but she was, she boldly followed her, knowing that she wasn't from there and will always, be viewed as an outsider. She, irrespective of everything, she held on to the fact that she would follow Naomi, and her God will be her God and her people will be her people. God's hand of providence was definitely in the midst of Ruth's story. It wasn't chance or happenstance, I believe, that she ended up gleaning, in the field of Boas. And also we see God's law, which provided for the poor and the foreigner as a catalyst for their meeting. God's welfare plan made provision for the less privileged. And at that point, that was what they were, Ruth and Naomi. But she chose, to go out and provide for her mother-in-law, and God, was with her. One thing that I've heard, and I've noticed before, but then worth pointing out is that in the book of Ruth is a book where God isn't mentioned at all. He's alluded to, but not mentioned. But we see God's plans and the things he already sent forward, like the laws and all these things come into play. How awesome was that? So Boaz was a good man, rich, influential, but also very kind and considerate. His prayer for Ruth in 2:12 showed that he was spiritual, that he was a man, of prayer, which was probably rare in a time during the Judges when everyone was wilding out. The practice of the levirate marriage, do you remember that? We spoke about it, the marriage of a widow by a redeemer, kinsman redeemer, if her husband dies. So it was a concept that was at play with Ruth and Boaz to continue the family line. Boaz, by taking this responsibility up, would care for Ruth as the widow of his relative, but then he would be her kinsman redeemer, which was a foreshadowing of Christ as our ultimate redeemer. Because of Ruth's virtuous character, Boaz was willing to undertake the levirate marriage and not out of compulsion. We've seen before how, remember when we read, I think it was in Deuteronomy or so, where if someone refused, then he even got his spit on in the face because it was seen as a disgrace or something very bad. But it was obvious that Boaz, even though he was a much older man, because he kept referring to her as my daughter, but he seemed impressed that in spite of her beauty and her humility, she chose boldly to come to him for his seek his redemption. This was, the time when she went into the barn during the barley harvest, as guided by Naomi, and this obviously motivated him to act quickly. So Boaz wasn't in a position where he was even looking to reject, the Levirate rights. I couldn't help comparing Ruth to Tamar. While Ruth trusted God's plan as directed by Naomi, Tamar took matters into her own hands, and it was a scandal that ensued, even though God's will still was done in the midst of the scandal. But both women were included in the genealogy of Christ, showing that God doesn't only look for and use perfect plans and situations, he also uses us with flaws and all. Ruth's commitment to Naomi and their consequent relationship is a reflection of what wife and daughter-in-law relationships should really be. Was it perfect? No, because we saw that Naomi even became bitter at some point, and I'm sure an ordinary person would have been frustrated, but that just helped, that just motivated Ruth to be more resourceful, which I thought was really good. Ruth bore a son with Boaz, who eventually became the grandfather of King David. Now here's where I saw God in these chapters where God wasn't mentioned. God is the God of the outsider. And here's a fun fact. Boaz was the son of Rahab. Remember Rahab, the prostitute that was delivered or saved from Jericho? Yeah, that's her son. And Rahab and Ruth was a foreigner. So two foreigners came together, and God used them to produce the lineage of a great king and the King of Glory, Jesus. God works through seemingly bad and written off situations to bring about his goodwill, and this is what he did to redeem Israel and also to redeem us as well. How amazing is that? So yes, guys, we're done with the book of Ruth. Tomorrow we will start with our 10th book of the Bible, the book of 1 Samuel. See you here. Bye.